Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. For this week's video, I want to present another layout design project. This layout design is in HO scale for a long, narrow attic space. Overall dimensions are a little over 39 feet by 14, with stairs leading down in one corner. Here is a cross-section of the space. You can see that we have minimal headroom along the sides, but for most of its width we have about 7 foot 7 inch headroom, so still less than most living spaces, but sufficient. This is the sketch that the client sent me at the start of the project. At first he was wanting to include a desk as a workspace, although before we got very far into the process he said to ignore that. Now I will give my viewers fair warning. This layout design has by far the highest track density of any layout I have ever drawn. I offer no apologies. That was always going to be the case right from the start, based on what the client wanted. It also includes the largest staging yard that I've ever drawn for a model railroad. Here is the client's space drawn out to scale. At this point, there was still some question as to exactly the size of the stairs and the folding door that hinged down over the top of them. Now the client wanted a large passenger terminal, and his layout desires had been influenced by a model railroad that was featured in the Model Railroader some years ago based on the New Orleans Union Passenger Terminal. I don't know what date that was, but I do recall seeing that layout. And the client had already at one point built a 5 foot wide peninsula down the middle and tried to design a passenger terminal for it with a Y axis and a freight yard along the north wall. So my first footprint was basically to copy this and to just see how much space we could allocate for the railroad while making sure that the aisles were of sufficient width and sufficient headroom as well. Because if you recall, any aisle that's too close to the side walls is not going to have full stand-up headroom. Anyway, at first I drew a pair of curves opposite each other in the entrance with the minimum of 30-inch radius, just to see how much space we had between them. I figured that we could get about 33 inches of walkway between them, which is a little bit tight, but still doable. Although the client soon decided that he wanted to go bigger than 30-inch radius, which means that we can't have this arrangement of having two circles opposite each other. Right from the beginning, the idea was to have the railroad built at a height that would allow us to use the full width of the room, but still allow the main line to run around the end of the room, over the stairs, and over this dwarf wall, which from memory I think was 35.5 inches high, while the side walls are about 47 inches high, meaning that we should end up with a main line somewhere in the region of 40 inches. Anyway, as I said, this is the first footprint that I drew, and it looks as though the peninsula is going to be a lot longer than we actually need it for a passenger terminal. So this led to the second footprint. Here what I've done is wrapped one of the side aisles around the end to give better access to the window. It also means that we can have an extra blob at the base of the peninsula and possibly do away with Circle B to widen the entryway. And I believe the peninsula is still plenty long enough. Here is another slight variation where I am moving the one blob back slightly away from the stairs to allow a short side aisle and thus give us better access to the space in this corner. The client had already done some measurements and found that we could go to at least 40 inches of width over the stairs without infringing on full walk-under headroom, although I never planned to go quite that wide because of access to the far corner. Here is another variation where I widened the benchwork and the aisle on one side and reduced it on the other, the idea being that we now have a main aisle and a secondary aisle, and the main aisle has better headroom with the peninsula slightly off to one side. And the hope here is to avoid any possibility of the space feeling claustrophobic, especially if you recall we have a lower than normal ceiling. And I wanted to be able to open up a better sight line from the top of the stairs directly to the window. Now all of the designs so far have assumed a stub terminal, we briefly looked into the possibility of going for a through terminal. And to do that, we're going to have to close off one of the main aisles and turn it into an isolated access space. Ignore the circles A and C here for now. The intention of this plan is to show how we can have a through terminal winding its way through the middle of the room. The center still is a long enough straight to get a good terminal with the two approach areas on angles. Here is another variation where we, instead of going all the way back into the corner, run the center lobe straight down towards the window. And here is an attempt to make use of the diagonal of the room by curving the center section off to one side again and putting a Y in the corner, although we quickly decided that this was not going to work. Anyway, the client looked at these footprints for some considerable time before deciding that a stub terminal was the way to go. He decided that he wanted to be able to view it from both sides without the crawl under to an isolated aisle. This drawing goes back to the original footprint, the very first one that I drew, and attempts to see whether we can get a proper Y access to the terminal within the confines of the space. Now, I did remember that the New Orleans layout that I referred to earlier had a Y access in a room that was about the same width, but I didn't recall how it was done. Anyway, eventually, after digging out that plan, I realized that he'd gone to a single track Y, thus saving quite a lot of width and eliminating these two diamond crossings at the two corners of the Y. I'm not going to show that plan, just in case I run afoul of copyright infringement. If you want to compare that design with mine, then you'll have to look it up on the Model Railroader track plan database. Anyway, we both agreed that a single track access to such a large passenger terminal was not going to look right. We wanted to keep a multi-track approach, allowing for simultaneous arrivals and departures. So we decided to abandon the straight peninsula, and we went back to working on the one with the side access, and also giving us better access to the window as a bonus. This plan now has the helix drawn of a slightly larger radius, so you'll notice that the bulge on the other side is no longer wide enough for a full circle of track. And if we count the squares, we can see that the passenger terminal is still plenty long enough. Here is another view with all the mainline routes connected up, and the intention is to have a hidden connection in this corner, allowing for continuous running, which was something that the client wanted to do, even though most of the time he's going to be operating it point to point as a proper railroad. Right from the beginning, the other scene that he wanted on the layout was a harbour, and we now have a good size area available for it. Here is the first drawing of the staging area, and as I mentioned earlier, it is a huge staging yard. Long-time viewers of my channel will that I always recommend planning for as much staging as possible. And in this particular case, this was doubly important since the client had two complete sets of trains that he wanted to be able to switch out. Although most of the time his three railroads that he wanted to represent are the C&O, the B&O, and the Western Maryland, but he also had a large quantity of British trains. So from time to time he wanted to be able to clear all the American trains out from the visible portion of the railroad into staging yards and then run his British trains. So that is why we have the three big yards, so that he could switch out his trains without having to lift them off the track and store them in boxes. Here we are back at the main scenic level again, and we've included a small interchange yard along the south wall. This yard is owned by the Western Maryland, and it not only serves the harbour but also as an interchange from the main yard, which is operated jointly by the B&O and the C&O. I later dubbed that yard Boco Yard. This drawing is a natural progression of the west end of the railroad. Instead of having the Western Maryland join up with the main line again, it runs off to staging via its own single track main. Now we've decided that all passenger trains from all three companies will use the same passenger terminal and the same double track main line into staging, but the Western Maryland freight trains will use this single track and take a different route to staging, implying that they have another major yard just off the visible portion of the railroad. I've connected them back up again under the main freight yard. I could have put the turnouts at this end and saved a little bit of track, but by moving them further to the east, it means that there is more reaching distance above them, thus making them easier to maintain. At this point, the general schematic was accepted, and it's time to start working on the details, just making sure that everything will in fact fit. Here is the upper deck with most of the track drawn in. The main passenger terminal is 8 tracks wide, and I've taken a detail from the New Orleans layout that I referenced earlier and placed the station concourse on an angle. Not only does this add a lot of interest, but it helps to make the tracks different lengths. The longest track at the south side is around 15 feet long, which would probably equate to 3 E units and a 13-car consist, whereas the other tracks get gradually shorter until the last track is only about 8 or 9 feet long. I've added 2 tracks for the commissary, a coach yard, post office and railway express agency, along with a few industries across the end. The client wanted to keep the Western Maryland freight main open instead of disappearing from view straight after the yard. That leads to the complex but workable diagonal flyover. It took a few attempts to get it to work, but eventually we're both happy with the alignment of it. And note how the 3-track station approach allows for simultaneous arrivals and departures, as is correct prototype practice on a large passenger terminal. The near track around this curve is actually the switching lead and relief main line, which would allow light engine movements to keep clear of the main lines. And also empty coaching stock can be run past the freight yard to this balloon loop around the engine terminal for turning consists. This we felt was a good alternative after we had to eliminate the Y. The cutoff in the southwest corner is now longer. Not only does this greatly improve the grade profile, but also allows for a pair of long running loops which can hold 1 really long train or 2 medium length trains on each track. Now these tracks will eventually be hidden, thus disguising the continuous run and allowing trains to reappear in a different order from where they disappeared. Thus these connections can still be used during regular operation, each one effectively being a 2-track staging yard. Along the north side, there is a good-sized freight yard. The longest arrival-departure track is a little over 20 feet long, so a good length for through freights. I've separated the steam terminal from the diesel engine service. The client has a lot of big steam locomotives and a few diesels, so these proportions work well. I mentioned that he's running both B&O and C&O trains on this portion of the railroad, so we have 2 double-ended caboose tracks. One of them is significantly longer than the other, so obviously whichever road he has the most cabooses for will be the one that he allocates the long track to. When it came to laying out the harbour, there was another layout design that I had done some time ago with a small harbour. Ironically, it was also an HO scale layout in an attic, but anyway, the client decided that he really liked that harbour and wanted something similar, so that's what I've done here. There is a car float, which he already has, so that had to be that specific size. He liked the elevated track across the harbour with a local passenger station on it, although I haven't actually drawn that at this point. And also I haven't drawn in the industrial trackage along the north wall and in the northwest corner. I just made sure that I left enough space behind the main lines for it. Anyway, at this point, the customer really liked what was being presented. There were a few changes we decided to make. There was some tweaking in this area with the positioning of the coach yard, post office and REA, and he decided that he would rather have the scrapyard move from this location to the harbour. So here is the main level, virtually complete. I've made the changes that I talked about previously and also filled in the industries along the north wall. I hooked them up to the main line with just a single crossover at this end and put a run round clear of the main along the back wall. And then we decided that the major industry in this corner was going to be a brewery. I have not done a lot of research on rail-served breweries, so the track and building locations are not intended to be accurate. They're just placeholders. He will make any changes necessary to this area when the time comes to build it. I've shown a continuous row of city buildings hiding the 4 running loops along the south wall. And with a little space above the track before it hits the ceiling, some of these buildings can actually be full depth instead of just backdrop flats. In order to give some depth, I had this highway overpass ending in a mirror. Note how the post office tower block is directly opposite the mirror, so it is completely impossible to ever see your reflection in it from any normal viewing location. And here is the local passenger station in the corner. I also drew it as part of a passenger ferry terminal, although he decided he didn't like that idea, and he wanted the station reduced to about half its size. And one other change that he requested was the removal of this fishing wharf. He felt that it was better to just have the Benchwork run straight across this area and leave more people space in the entrance to the room. Here is another view of that same design with the relevant track elevations filled in. As I mentioned earlier, the main track level is at 40 inches, although in the southeast corner we dropped to 37 to make the grades easier, and the minimum track elevation is around 33.5 inches at the harbour, although this was tweaked a little bit, and in the final design we ended up with slightly more at this point. Here is what I dubbed the mezzanine level. It just shows the main lines going from the visible portion to the helix, which is under the engine terminal. So by the time we get to this point, we've already lost at least half the distance to the staging level. So it turns out that the helix is actually only 1.5 laps. I've also included a long passing siding on the WM freight main, just in case it's desired to be able to run a train from staging and hold it here until it's needed. And since the client is going to be running a couple of doodle bugs, I decided that a couple of short spurs on this level made sense instead of having to run them all the way down to staging where they would occupy long through tracks. Here is the staging level, everything drawn at 20 inches, with the first throat of this yard having the vertical curve getting to 21 inches by the time we are in the helix. It's important to note when we are using the areas above or below a helix that the grades must extend well beyond the exit from the helix. And I've shown turntable releases at the ends of the auxiliary staging yards with multiple spare engine tracks. I don't know whether he's going to build it that way. He might just decide to run stub tracks and put engine storage facilities somewhere else. Here is the final version of the main level with all the annotations removed to keep it clean. And as you can see, the bulge at this point has been eliminated. And I took the opportunity to turn the scrapyard spur around as I kicked back from the main wharf. That way it can be level at the same harbour elevation instead of having to fight the grades, because the grade down to the harbour runs all the way through the first couple of turnouts to give us enough clearance under this elevated section in the corner. Another change I made at this point was to improve the engine terminal. It's not that clear because it's only a very shallow wall, but there is a dummy track leading into a machine shop which can hide the front of the access opening. And I was also able to get 2 cold storage tracks behind the coaling tower as opposed to 1 on the previous design. Here is the final version of the mezzanine level. The only difference here is that the WM passing siding has been extended all the way around the curve, so the first turnout is actually on the visible portion of the railroad. Let me go back to that drawing quickly. Here we can see it being visible. It makes it a lot easier for maintenance. And at this point, we're assuming that it's the start of the Western Maryland lead track for their main yard, which would be just beyond the train room behind the brewery. A minimum mainline radius is 32 inches on the balloon loop. Everywhere else it's at least 34, and in most cases it's 40 or better. Most mainline turnouts are number 8, although I've used number 10s wherever they'll fit. The yard is laid out almost entirely with number 7s, with a few number 8s, and industrial trackage is almost entirely number 6s. I think I used 1 number 5 somewhere, but I can't remember where that was. Here is the final form of the staging level. Here everything is laid out with Pico number 6s and 8s, as well as a few of their curved turnouts. The only non-Pico turnouts on the staging yard are these 3 at this end, which have to be fast tracks, along with the whole of the visible level. Since most of the turnouts are of just 3 sizes, the client plans to build those himself and then just order the oddball sizes from me. Here are a few sample cross sections. just to show my suggestions of how they actually be built. For the most part, I've assumed that the back of the benchwork is attached to the side walls of the room, with the front supported on threaded rods. If you recall, there is some low-level trackage running across the window. Here I've shown how to shape the joists from plywood so that the double track main line at the rear can be supported, and how the single track main down to staging can be cantilevered off the front edge of the benchwork so as to avoid getting the frame any lower than it needs to be and restricting access to the staging yard. For the peninsula, of course, you're just stacking one table on top of the other, and although you won't need a lot of cross bracing, you will need one set near the end. That's what these two red areas represent. They're just showing how the track avoids them. The tabletop will keep it rigid for the rest of its length, as long as there is one set of diagonal bracing near the end of the peninsula. Now, since this is a very long, narrow design and not ideally proportioned for the screen, let me show the layout in two parts. Here is the west end enlarged so you can see the details better. I will leave that up for a few moments. And here is the east end. Anyway, that is about all I have to say on this layout design. Hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and I hope to see you again next week. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.